Somewhere on Earth, right now, two people are kissing for the first time. It feels ancient, instinctive, like something written into human DNA since the beginning of the species. Something every culture that has ever existed must have discovered independently, the same way every culture discovered fire. Here's the twist. It isn't. Not even close. More than half the cultures ever systematically studied on this planet have no ethnographic record of romantic kissing at all. Not don't like it, not rare but it happens, no record of it existing as a practice. So if kissing isn't some universal human wiring, hardwired into the species from the start, where did it even come from? And why does it feel so completely built in to the people who happen to grow up doing it? You'd assume something that feels this natural, this automatic, must be hardwired, species-wide, non-negotiable, the kind of behavior that shows up the same way in a Parisian nightclub and an isolated rainforest village, because it's simply part of being human. It's not. What's actually going on is stranger and more interesting than a simple biological instinct. Kissing looks like it might be, at its root, a cultural invention that spread unevenly across the world, one that later got tangled up with real, measurable biology once it existed in a population. Two completely different stories, running on top of each other, both true at once. Let's untangle them properly, one layer at a time. In 2015, anthropologists William Jankowiak, Shelley Volsch, and Justin Garcia published a large cross-cultural survey in the peer-reviewed journal American Anthropologist. This wasn't a casual internet poll. They systematically examined 168 distinct cultures, drawing on existing ethnographic databases as well as direct surveys sent to field anthropologists who had lived among and studied these societies firsthand. Their specific target was the romantic sexual kiss, which they defined carefully as lip-to-lip contact tied to a romantic or sexual context, whether brief or prolonged, deliberately excluding platonic cheek kissing or greeting customs, which are a separate behavior entirely. The result surprised even the researchers running the study. Romantic kissing, defined this way, showed up in only 46% of the cultures they examined, not a small minority holding out against a universal norm. Less than half. Entire regions of the ethnographic record, a large number of sub-Saharan African societies, several New Guinean cultures, and a number of Amazonian foraging societies among them, had no documented record of the behavior existing at all, based on the available ethnographic literature. Somewhere out there, an entire branch of humanity looked at the concept of mouth-to-mouth romantic contact and collectively said, "Interesting, no thank you, we'll pass." That 46% statistic can sound abstract until you see what it actually looked like when it played out in real historical encounters. Jankowiak and his co-authors, writing about their findings afterward, pointed to several documented historical reactions that make the statistic vivid rather than just numerical. When the Thonga people of southern Africa first witnessed Europeans kissing in 1890, their documented reaction was open disgust at what struck them as a strange and somewhat unsanitary custom. One historical account has them reacting with amused disbelief at the sight. A full century later, anthropologists documented an extremely similar reaction among the Mehinaku people of Amazonia, encountering the same behavior for the first time. Among the Trobriand islanders of Melanesia, studied extensively by the early anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski, kissing among Europeans was observed with genuine bemusement rather than romantic recognition. Malinowski's own field notes describe the islanders regarding it as a rather bland, mildly silly form of entertainment, not a courtship behavior they recognized or practiced themselves in that form. And this isn't only a story about kissing being absent. In many of these same cultures, other close, intimate greeting behaviors existed instead, just built around an entirely different sense: smell. The Maori hongi, a traditional greeting involving the pressing together of noses and foreheads while breathing in, is one well-documented example, And similar nose-to-nose, scent-based greeting customs have been documented by anthropologists and ethnographers across parts of the Arctic, Polynesia, and Southeast Asia. Charles Darwin himself, writing in 1872, described observing exactly this kind of nose-pressing greeting during his travels, and speculated it might represent a kind of primitive version of what Europeans did with lip-to-lip kissing, evidence that intimate, affectionate greeting itself is genuinely widespread across humanity, even in the many places where the specific lip-to-lip version of it never developed at all. Somewhere in the historical record is an entire culture's honest, documented first reaction to European-style kissing. And it amounts to, essentially, look at these people. Which is a very reasonable thing to think about a stranger putting their mouth on another stranger's mouth, if you've genuinely never seen it done before in your life. Here's where the data gets genuinely fascinating, and where it stops being just a fun trivia fact and starts pointing toward an actual explanation. The researchers didn't just find that kissing was unevenly distributed. They found it was unevenly distributed in a specific, patterned way. There was a strong correlation between how socially complex and stratified a culture is, meaning things like the presence of social classes, hierarchy, and differentiated status roles, and how likely romantic kissing was to appear as a documented practice within it. The more socially complex and stratified the society, statistically, the more common romantic kissing became. In simpler, more egalitarian foraging societies, without steep social hierarchies, it was comparatively rare or entirely absent in the record. That correlation is a genuinely strange thing for a biological instinct to do. Instincts like the startle reflex or an infant's grip reflex don't typically track something as specific and culturally contingent as social stratification. They show up reliably, regardless of how a society happens to be organized. Behaviors that spread and take root through cultural transmission and status signaling, on the other hand, often do track exactly this kind of variable, because they ride along with the social structures that reward or normalize them. So if it's not hardwired from the species' origin, where did it plausibly start, and how did it spread? One leading hypothesis, laid out directly by Jankowiak and his colleagues in their analysis, points to something almost mundane and distinctly unromantic. Kiss-like mouth-to-mouth contact may have originated in practices like pre-mastication, the historically documented practice found across a range of cultures of a parent chewing food and passing it mouth-to-mouth to an infant too young to chew solid food effectively on their own. That's a form of intimate, direct oral contact that long predates anything resembling courtship, and some researchers propose it as a plausible root behavior from which romantic kissing could have culturally branched off later in specific societies, once the underlying mouth-to-mouth contact was already a familiar, normalized part of close relationships. It's important to be precise here. This is a hypothesis about plausible origins, not a settled, proven fact. And Jankowiak and colleagues present it as one candidate explanation among the possibilities, not a closed case. But it reframes something important. Kissing may have started as an act of caregiving and nourishment between parent and child, and only much later, in certain cultural contexts, got culturally repurposed into something romantic between adults. Somewhere buried in that theory is the deeply unromantic idea that kissing's great-great-grandparent was, essentially, ancient hand-me-down baby food delivery, which is not the version of the origin story most people are picturing on a first date. Here's the twist inside the twist, and it's where things get genuinely scientific rather than just historical. Even if kissing started, culturally, as something closer to caregiving than courtship, once a behavior like this existed and got repurposed into a romantic context, biology got very interested very fast, because the mouth turns out to be an extraordinarily information-rich place to make contact with another person. Researchers Raphael Wlodarski and Robin Dunbar at the University of Oxford published a detailed review in 2013 in the journal Archives of Sexual Behavior, examining the possible functions kissing might actually serve. One of the leading hypotheses they discuss involves something called the MHC, or Major Histocompatibility Complex, a set of genes involved in immune system function. There's a well-known, frequently cited 1995 study by Claude Wedekind and colleagues, often nicknamed the sweaty t-shirt study, which found that women, when asked to smell and rate the body odor of t-shirts worn by different men, tended to prefer the scent of men whose MHC genes were more different from their own, a pattern that would make evolutionary sense, since offspring from MHC diverse pairings tend to have stronger, more varied immune function. Wlodarski and Dunbar's work builds directly on this line of research, proposing that close mouth-to-mouth contact could function as a close-range olfactory and gustatory check, sampling scent, taste, and subtle chemical cues that might carry exactly this kind of genetic compatibility information that's much harder to access from a distance. It's worth being honest that the MHC hypothesis isn't the only serious explanation on the table, and Wlodarski and Dunbar themselves lay out multiple competing theories rather than declaring a single winner. In follow-up research, including a 2013 online survey of over 900 adults, Wlodarski specifically described three main competing theories about what kissing does. First, that it helps assess a potential partner's underlying genetic or health quality, in the spirit of the MHC hypothesis. Second, that it functions primarily to increase physical arousal, helping initiate further intimacy. And third, that its main function is relationship maintenance, helping sustain bonding and attachment between partners who are already together, separate from any mate assessment function at all. Their survey data suggested these functions may matter differently depending on context. Kissing seemed to carry more mate assessment weight earlier in a relationship, and more of a bonding, maintenance-oriented role once a relationship was established. That's a meaningfully more complicated picture than kissing exists to check genetic compatibility. And it's the honest, current state of a research question that's still actively being worked out. So depending on which researcher you ask, a first kiss is either a genetic compatibility test, a highly effective ignition switch, or a bonding ritual. And the slightly unsatisfying truth is that it might be running all three jobs simultaneously, in proportions nobody has fully pinned down yet. You might expect animal behavior to clear this up decisively. Surely if our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, kiss too, that proves the behavior is biological and evolved, right? It's genuinely more complicated than that. Chimpanzees and bonobos have been observed engaging in mouth-to-mouth contact, including open-mouth contact, documented by primatologists including Franz de Waal in specific social contexts, most notably during reconciliation after conflict within the group, rather than in courtship contexts. That's real, well-documented primate behavior, not a myth. But researchers working in this specific area, including Wlodarski and Dunbar in their review, have explicitly noted that this doesn't settle whether human romantic kissing shares the same evolutionary origin as primate mouth-to-mouth contact, or whether it's a separately, independently invented human cultural practice that simply happens to resemble behavior seen elsewhere in the primate family. Similar looking behavior across related species doesn't automatically mean identical evolutionary origins or functions. The resemblance could be coincidence, convergence, or genuine shared ancestry. And the current evidence doesn't cleanly settle which. Here's a piece of research that turns the abstract idea of kissing as health assessment into something startlingly specific and measurable. In 2014, microbiologist Remco Kort and colleagues at TNO and the Micropia Museum in the Netherlands published a study in the peer-reviewed journal Microbiome, examining exactly what gets physically exchanged during a kiss. They studied 21 couples, swabbing their tongues and saliva, and ran a controlled experiment where one partner drank a probiotic yogurt containing trackable marker bacteria before kissing the other. The result? Precisely measured rather than estimated. A single intimate kiss lasting about 10 seconds transfers, on average, roughly 80 million bacteria between partners. The study also found something else worth sitting with. Couples who kissed at least 9 times a day had measurably more similar communities of oral bacteria than couples who kissed less frequently, and far more similar than the oral bacteria of 2 unrelated people picked at random. Somewhere in that finding is possibly the least romantic way to describe a first kiss ever devised by science. A spontaneous, mutually consented bacterial transfer event timed at roughly 8 million microbes per second. This adds real, measured weight to the broader idea running through this video, that whatever cultural or social reasons kissing started for, biology found something concrete and functional to do with it once it existed. A genuine, trackable exchange of microbial and immune-relevant information between 2 people at a scale nobody could have consciously detected or intended, happening automatically every single time. Here's the reframe that explains the gap between all this data and your own gut feeling that kissing is obviously, unquestionably natural. You almost certainly grew up inside or were heavily exposed to, through globalized media, film, and advertising, one of the more socially complex, kissing normative cultures the Jankowiak study describes. From early childhood, you likely saw the behavior modeled constantly and unremarkably in your family, in the stories you were told, in the media you consumed before you were even old enough to critically evaluate any of it. A behavior doesn't need to be biologically universal across the species to feel completely instinctive and automatic to the specific people raised inside a culture that normalizes it early, constantly, and without comment. That's not a flaw in your personal intuition. It's simply what cultural transmission reliably does to a learned behavior. It makes things that were absorbed, not innate, feel exactly like instinct from the inside. It's tempting to file all of this away as a historical curiosity, true of the 1800s and unlikely to still be relevant now that global media has supposedly flattened these cultural differences. But meaningful variation in kissing norms remains observable today, not just deep in the historical record. Public displays of romantic affection, kissing very much included, remain far more socially restricted or actively discouraged in a number of contemporary societies than they are in much of Western film and advertising, sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes simply because public romantic touch of any kind is considered a private matter rather than something appropriate to display openly. Meanwhile, plenty of contemporary greeting customs around the world still rely on cheek touching or nose-to-nose traditions discussed earlier, existing comfortably alongside, rather than being fully replaced by, the specifically romantic lip-to-lip version most associated with globalized Western media. The honest picture isn't the whole world quietly converged on one universal kissing norm once everyone got a smartphone. It's closer to this. One specific, historically Western-associated version of intimate greeting became extremely visible globally through film, television, and advertising, without necessarily replacing every local alternative it encountered along the way. The 46% statistic from 2015 isn't a snapshot of a vanished past. It's closer to a photograph of something still actively, unevenly in motion. And this connects to something considerably bigger than kissing itself. Jankowiak and his co-authors point directly, in their own discussion, at what they term a kind of Western ethnocentrism running quietly underneath a lot of earlier anthropological assumptions. The tendency to assume that whatever feels pleasurable, natural, and universal within one's own culture must therefore be a genuine human universal, true of the species as a whole, rather than a specific, unevenly distributed cultural practice. Kissing turns out to be a small, oddly personal, oddly intimate example of a pattern that shows up constantly across many areas of research, mistaking normal where I happen to be from for true of humanity everywhere. The data here doesn't just quietly correct one specific fact about kissing. It functions as a genuinely useful small case study in exactly how easily culture can disguise itself convincingly as biology, right up until someone actually goes and checks 168 cultures one at a time. So the next time you see two people kiss, and it registers instantly and effortlessly as the single most natural thing in the world, it is natural for you, specifically, inside the culture that raised you and shaped what feels automatic to you. But for a little under half of the societies humans have ever built and anthropologists have ever carefully studied, it never was. Not less romantic for the people in those cultures, not less human, just a different, culturally specific answer to a question you probably never thought to ask about your own most intimate moments. Is this really instinct, or is this inheritance, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that it stopped feeling like anything you ever had to learn at all?